because we're going to talk a little bit about the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9. When we read the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9, we're often struck by the very odd literary style. I hope you were struck by the odd literary style and the repetitiveness and the contradictions. So I want to ask you now, and be brave and speak out. In your reading of the story, did anything of that nature strike you? Was the story hard to follow? Was it self-contradictory? And in what ways? Anything. Just don't even be polite. Just throw it right out there. Yes? Okay, we seem to have two sets of instructions, right? Someone's pointing out here, we seem to have two sets of instructions about what to bring on board. Either to bring 2 of each sort of living thing, animals and birds and creeping things, or in another passage, God tells Moses to bring on 7 pairs of pure animals and 1 pair of impure animals and 7 pairs of birds, right? Different sets of instructions. Anything else strike you as odd when you were reading this story? Right, okay, rain seems to be there for different amounts of time, doesn't it? There are some passages in which the flood is said to last for 40 days or be on the earth for 40 days. We find that in Genesis 7, verse 17. But in Genesis 7, verse 24, 150 days is given as the time of the flood. Anything else? Any other sorts of doublets or contradictions? Because there are a few more. Who's giving the instructions? That's not hard. That's not hard. You have it right in front of you. Who's giving the instructions? Okay, God. We have the word God being used, I guess, in that translation, right, with a capital G. What else is used? Lord. Those are actually different Hebrew words underneath there. Okay? Those two terms are different names for the deity that's giving the instruction. Okay? So there are 2 designations used for God. Yahweh, which is the sacred tetragrammaton. It's written with 4 letters in Hebrew. They don't include vowels. We don't really know how it's pronounced. I'm guessing at Yahweh. And that is a proper name for God. And in your translation, that will be translated as Lord in small caps. So wherever you see Lord in small caps, that's actually the English translation for Yahweh. The proper name, like almost a personal name for God. And then in other places, we have this word Elohim, which actually is the word for gods, a sort of generic term for deities in the plural. However, when it's used to refer to the God of Israel, it's clearly singular. It always has a singular verb. So that will be appearing in your text as God with a capital G. Okay? So whenever you see Lord or God, those are actually pointing to different words that are being used in the underlying Hebrew text. Twice, God is said to look down on creation. Twice, it is said that he is displeased. Twice he decides to destroy all living things. Twice he issues instructions, and as we've seen, they're contradictory. We seem to also have a different account of how long the flood lasted. There are more subtle contradictions throughout as well. Sometimes the flood seems to be the result of very heavy rain, but in other descriptions it seems to be a real cosmic upheaval. You'll remember the description of the world from Genesis 1 as an air bubble, essentially, that's formed by separating waters above and waters below, and they're held back or pressed back by the firmament above. And it's the windows in the firmament that are open. Those waters are allowed to rush in and dissolve that air bubble. It's as if we're back to square one with the deep, right? Just this watery mass again. So it's creation undoing itself in some of the descriptions, as opposed to just heavy rain. And in keeping with that idea of a kind of a return to chaos, Noah is represented in a way as the beginning of a new creation. Because like Adam and Eve in the first creation story, Noah is told to be fruitful and multiply. He's also given rule over everything, and that's now extended to the taking of human life. The Bible contains a lot of repetition and contradiction. And sometimes it occurs in one passage, as in the flood story here, and sometimes it occurs in stories or passages that are separate from one another. For example, the 2 creation stories. There are many significant differences between the 2 creation stories. They differ greatly in style. Genesis 1 is formalized. It's highly structured, right? It has the 7 days and everything's paired up. It's beautifully structured. It's very abstract. Genesis 2 is much more dramatic, much more earthy. The first creation story doesn't really contain puns and word plays. It's a little bit serious. The second creation story is full of them. There are all sorts of little ironies and puns in the Hebrew. Adam, the earthling made from the earth. Adam is made from Adamah. Adam and Eve are naked, arum, which is the same word for clever or shrewd, and the snake is arum. He's clever and shrewd. There are lots of little puns of this kind. There are also differences in terminology between the two stories. Genesis 1 speaks of male and female. It's one set of Hebrew terms, but Genesis 2 uses man and woman, a different set of Hebrew terms to describe the genders. So the terms for gender are different in the two stories. Genesis 1 refers to God as, in your translation, God, right? Elohim, the word that's translated as God. He's remote. He's transcendent. He creates effortlessly through his word and through his will. But Genesis 2 refers to the deity as a name that's really a combination. It's Yahweh Elohim. So you'll see Lord God, right? You see that a lot in the Bible as well. Lord God, that tells you both of those words are side by side in the original Hebrew. So in Genesis 2, the deity is Yahweh Elohim. He's much more down to earth. He forms the human like a potter working with clay. He talks to himself. He plants a garden. He takes a stroll in the garden in the cool of the evening. He makes clothes for Adam and Eve. He's spoken of in much more anthropomorphic terms than the God that we encounter in Genesis 1. So what we have in the first few chapters of Genesis are two creation stories. They have distinctive styles, distinctive themes, distinctive vocabularies, and they're placed side by side. In Genesis 6 through 9, we seem to have two flood stories with distinctive styles and themes and vocabularies and substantive details, but they're interwoven instead of being placed side by side. And there are many such doublets in the Bible. At times, we have whole books that repeat or go over the same material. In fact, the whole historical saga that's recorded from Genesis through the end of 2 Kings is rehearsed again in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What are we to make of the repetitions and the contradictions here and throughout the Bible? What are the implications? Suppose you came across a piece of writing that you knew nothing about, just lying there on the table. You didn't know who wrote it, where, when, how, why. And someone says to you, I want you to draw some conclusions about that piece of writing. I want you to draw some conclusions about its authorship and the way it was compiled or composed. And so you pick it up and you start reading and you notice features like this. What might you conclude? Throw it out. What might you conclude? No presuppositions. You pick up the work and you find these features. What might you conclude about its authorship or manner of composition? Yeah. You might conclude that there are multiple authors, right? Multiple authorship. Yeah? That revisions may have been made so that you might have different sources that have been revised or put together in different ways, right? Revisions implying you've got something and then it's worked over again. Additions might be made, so now that's a new source, right? You might conclude that these features are evidence of multiple authorship, a good deal of revision, which points itself to a kind of composite structure, different layers, maybe different sources. Well, as early as the Middle Ages, there were some scholars who noticed these things in the biblical text. They noticed that there were contradictions and repetitions, and there are anachronisms too, other features that were evidence of multiple authorship, revisions, and composite structure. So what? Why would that be a big deal? Okay, we can all go home then. There's no problem with that, right? Why would that be a big deal? Yeah.
It's a central text for your religion. If there are contradictions, you've got a bit of a problem finding what exactly you believe.
Okay, it could be a bit of a problem if this text has become the basis for a system of religious faith or belief, and your assumptions about it are that it's telling a truth that is singular in nature. And also, what about the traditional beliefs and the origin of this text? Right? Who wrote this text according to traditional beliefs? I'm hearing Moses, I'm hearing God, I'm hearing a bunch of different things, but right, there are traditional ideas about generally the Mosaic authorship of the Bible, certainly the first 5 books of the Bible. And so these features of the text, which were noticed, were a challenge to traditional religious convictions regarding the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible, and in many ways the perfection of the Bible, as speaking with a unified voice on matters of doctrine or religious theology. So medieval commentators, for example, began to speak a little bit more openly about some of these features. One of the first things they noticed is that Deuteronomy 34 describes the death and burial of Moses. So they decided it was possible that Moses didn't write at least that chapter. Similarly, there are some anachronisms that they had to explain. One of the most famous is in Genesis 13, verse 7. It's in the midst of a story about dividing the land between Lot and, at that time his name is Abram, it later becomes Abraham, but between Lot and Abram. And the narrator, in telling this story, sort of interjects and turns to us, the readers, and says, the Canaanites and Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. Now, what's weird about that sentence? The narrator is speaking to us from a time in which the Canaanites and Perizzites don't live in the land, right? Saying, that's back when the Native Americans lived in Connecticut. Is that writer living at a time when Native Americans are still living in Connecticut or owning Connecticut? No, they're writing from a later point of view. So the narrator breaks and talks to the audience in Genesis 13 and 7, says, that was back in the time when the Canaanites were in the land. When did Moses live? Who lived in the land in the time of Moses? The Canaanites. I know you haven't gotten there yet, but when you get to Deuteronomy, you're going to find out he doesn't make it into the land. So he never makes it in there. He never gets in before the Israelites conquer. He dies. The Canaanites are still in possession. So that line was certainly written not by Moses. It was written by someone at a much later time who's looking back and referring to the time when the Canaanites were in the land. So these are the kinds of things that people began to notice. And with the rise of rationalism in the modern period, traditional notions of the divine and Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, were called into question. The modern critical study of the Bible begins really with Spinoza, who in the early 17th century suggested that the Bible should be studied and examined like any book, without presuppositions about its divine origin or any other dogmatic claims about its composition or authorship. But it was a Catholic priest, Richard Simon, who first argued that Moses didn't write the Torah and that it contained many anachronisms and errors. We've run out of time, but I'll pick up this fascinating story on Wednesday, and we'll learn a little bit more about critical ideas about the composition of the Bible. Please be on the lookout for emails from section leaders with study guides for sections which will be meeting this week. You'll have a lot of fun with the creation stories.